Linda Size Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone.
Hi, welcome to Arcane Mark.
Welcome.
Today's episode is going to be about pre-generated characters.
Yes. So, if you've been around the tabletop RPG scene for long enough, then you would know that pre-generated characters are sometimes considered to be, if not a taboo, then at least like a faux pas or somehow a type of thing that are not generally accepted at every table. Now, that's not true everywhere, but if you look at it sort of across the spectrum and you like ask about what is the etiquette of the GM building the characters for the players, you'll generally find that people run kind of negative about that. However, sometimes it's just the thing that will make your campaign better or stronger. So we're going to have this episode be about how and when to break the taboo and how to do it in a way that you'll have an exciting campaign and happy players.
So, first of all, the idea of pre-generating characters is a spectrum. A lot of times when folks think about pre-generated characters, they think about like, you know, the player walks up to the table, the GM gives them a character and says, this is your character. Or maybe, here's 4 characters, each of you pick one of them. But pre-generating characters doesn't have to be all or nothing like that. You can have any degree of GM involvement in the process. I mean, a lot of folks enjoy having some aspect of GM involvement in terms of things where the GM might be like, you know, here's some backgrounds for the campaign. Everyone pick one of those backgrounds. Or, we need to have, we need to have someone fill this particular role in the party for the story. Or that kind of thing.
That's generally widely accepted. And to the extent that here are some sort of campaign backgrounds, I'd like everyone to pick one of those backgrounds. That's generally considered to be something that, like, even in, pre-written campaigns, they often have such backgrounds, and GMs who homebrew a campaign and make those backgrounds, people would just generally nod almost anywhere. Especially if you said, well, I'd really prefer these backgrounds, but if you need to, you can pick a different background. However, as Linda said, when you move towards the other end of the spectrum where the GM is generating more and more of the content, people can raise more and more of an eyebrow, except in a few situations. Even people who are the most adamantly opposed to pre-generated characters will usually say, okay, well, if you have someone who walks in at the last minute and they're new and you expected that might happen, and you had a few pre-generated characters, you just handed them one, okay, they didn't have time to build a character, if they didn't bring one. And then for number 2, okay, if you have a one-shot scenario, and it's just about those characters, and you play the one-shot, and part of the one-shot is people read their sheet and say, oh, in my role, my character is the queen, and this person is the vizier, or something like that. Okay. Most people will accept that premise as well. But then beyond that, they'll go, okay, but those are the only times.
Yeah.
However, that's not true.
So, when you're looking at pre-generated characters, an important question to ask is, why can't the players generate their characters for themselves in this particular situation? You talked about, like, there's limitations on time that can especially be rough with like a new player who doesn't really know the system, and then they're like, oh, I just want to try this out. If the idea is that building a character is going to be a substantial barrier to entry to that person because that player just wants to try it out and wants to get a feel for what the system's like before they get into the nuts and bolts of character creation, then that can be a very valuable tool.
And to that extent, there's sometimes players who really would prefer to have a character pre-built or would feel anxious about building their own characters. They're, kind of rare in the discourse about where GMs doing this is seen as bad. However, in many of those cases, even if you ask and say, I'm happy to build anybody's characters, people might have anxiety and be like, ooh, I don't want to impose on the GM about that. Or, no, I'm supposed to make the character. So if you're just worried about a situation where you, from the GM perspective, don't need a pre-generated character for any reason, but you want to make sure that the players are comfortable or they have what they need, you might consider creating a pre-generated character or two, and then you just hand those out as materials and say, hey, if anybody wants, I've got these characters. You could use them either as a pre-generated character or as a starting point and then customize it like as a template to build your own character. Especially if you know one of the players like gets a little much of their head spinning from how many options there are in whatever game you're playing, whether it's Pathfinder, D&D, or something else, and that it takes them a long time, or they always come to the session having not completed it because it seems like it's not something they enjoy doing. If you give them a template to start out with, that can be something where they can do whatever they want at that point. In fact, it helps improve agency, which is one of the main issues that a lot of people have with pre-generated characters when they do have issues, because even if they choose to take the pre-generated character exactly as is, at that point, they have made the decision. They've gone through, they presumably read it and looked at each decision that you made, and they made the decision to keep all those decisions. It therefore becomes theirs in a sense, and they gain agency and they gain sort of an attachment to those decisions that you as the GM made because they approved them.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases with this sort of situation, you'll be having a conversation with the player about what kind of character do they want to play. So if you know that, they want to play a, sort of a stereotypical sneaky type rogue character, then, you can ask some questions of them. Would you rather, a rogue type character that give like a, a general archetype? You can ask them questions of them. Do you prefer like focusing on being able to disarm traps, or do you prefer focusing on like being able to fast talk your way through situations or things like that? Translating some of those, translating those major mechanical decisions into sort of a narrative conversation of what role they want to hold, and then you can create mechanics to support the player's idea. And then if you find that, as you're working through it, there are some parts that don't work so well, then that's what, character rebuilding is for. You can tweak in that regard. But it's, it's often a lot less daunting for players who are like, oh my gosh, there's like thousands of options for what I can take. If you can simplify it down to a smaller number of options that all fit within the range of their conversation that they've had with you.
And if they don't want to impose, and so they won't tell you any specifications in that regard, then another thing that you can just do is have a few pre-generated characters for different classes and just be like, here they are. Especially if you're the kind of person who just makes 100 characters in Path Builder, so you just already have them. Then you don't even need to spend time on it. You can just be like, whatever class you're looking for, here's a few pre-generated characters, and then they can go look at it themselves. However, if they have analysis paralysis, if they get overwhelmed, be cognizant and don't send them 100 characters, because that's overwhelming in its own right. Try to find a way to balance the amount that the person gets overwhelmed by options with the amount that they maybe don't want to impose on you, or don't want to like get involved or make it be a heavy lift.
This came up a lot in Pathfinder Society, particularly for first edition Pathfinder, where there were so many different pre-generated characters, and Bad Guy's talking about considering the complexity of pre-gens in addition to the role. This is part of what you do there, is say, okay, well, if somebody's just walking up to the table and they haven't really played before, I'm probably not going to want to give them the more complex pre-gen. I'm going to want to have options I want to have a few more complicated options maybe, but mostly have a wide variety of roles covered.
I'm strongly in favor of labeling things with their complexity. In Eldamon, I labeled the elements based on their complexity, how difficult they were, not only to grok as the player, but sometimes like ice element I labeled as being pretty complex, not because the mechanics are actually fairly simple to apply, but because your entire team needs to work together, or at least be willing not to be completely antagonistic to you if what you're doing is lowering the enemy's movement speed.
Yeah.
Since they could just charge into the enemy with lowered movement speed anyway, making that pointless. And so having a label for complexity is just good practice altogether, and it can certainly help if you have a suite of pregens. Even if it's not like one person who you're just showing a bunch of characters, even if you're in the situation Linda said where it's like, here's 4 characters, pick one, everyone pick one. If you label them with their complexity, that can help the group decide which one they're going to pick. So I agree with Math Guy on that's a good idea.
Yeah, and I mean, in one of our favorite board games, Spirit Island labels the spirits with their complexity and role, and that's super useful when you're thinking about what you want to play.
All right, so let's say that it's not just a situation of somebody being overwhelmed where you would be perfectly fine if all the characters were generated by the players, but you're helping out. Let's say that you have a reason that you want to have a pre-generated element to the characters, but you're a little bit worried because, the general knowledge is that players won't buy into it. Well, one of the things I've found is that even though it's a taboo online and in the overall community, if you know your group, a lot of groups are okay with it if you discuss it with them in advance. If you ambush people who were expecting to build their own character, or worse, who already built one because you didn't tell them, and you're like, well, no, you're not playing that. You're playing one of these. That is just very bad, overall communication and setting of expectations.
Yeah.
If you let people know in advance, or even if you have, what I've done before is I've had multiple campaigns that I have the group vote on what campaign we're going to play next. I'd be like, this one is a campaign with pre-generated characters that they have very complex, backstories and secrets and story beats that have been sort of built into the characters that you're going to be able to see. Kind of like maybe, I didn't describe it at the time because there weren't as many, intricate actual plays with all those backstories. But if I did it in the modern day, I would be like, yeah, it's just like those. In those cases, the players and GM also really worked to create these backstories and make sure there would be these major arcs. That's kind of maybe harder to do for a group that's not professional actors, but for the GM, I've had situations where I was like, I've created some very convoluted stuff. You're gonna get a rich backstory and a lot of elements from this guaranteed, or we can play one of these pre-published adventure paths that has a lot of elements that's written. It's not as tied to your character, but I'll try to put you in there as best as I can. And in those cases, the players build their own characters. Sometimes with me putting my thumb on the scale when they describe those characters. And I'm not saying you need pre-generated characters in order to have intricate, weird stuff going on, or that adventure paths can't do that. I've described before how in my War for the Crown campaign, based on what the players wanted to play, I managed to sort of guide them into having one person who played a character who was absolutely perfect for sort of taking over the estate that you get in book 2 of the adventure path, and then one person who wound up as a member of an antagonist group because of what he said that he wanted to join, and he did not realize that his pen pals were antagonists. And you can do that. You can do that while the players entirely build their characters.
Yeah.
Just by having a dialogue. It is easier if you built their characters, or at least you built a significant portion of their characters with some input from them. So you can ask. You can see what people want. And if they say, no way, you're not building any of this, that is part of my fun, is that it's all me, then that might mean that pre-generated characters are not right for your group, or it's not right for a game with that person, and you might try a campaign with a slightly different mix-up for the pre-generated one.
And in that case, what was more important for the pre-generated characters wasn't necessarily the exact feats they chose or whatever have you, but it was sort of the character personality and backstory that was I'd say personality, backstory, and a little bit of the class were what was important.
Yeah, I would say that they weren't even pre-generated in the story I told for War for the Crown, but some of the campaigns I ran, I ran one where there were knights and other people who were trying to solve a mysterious problem and stop barbarians from rampaging over the kingdom. And there was a lot of strange things going on, but the mechanics weren't entirely the most important part. And in fact, it's not like I went in and leveled up the characters when they leveled up. The players leveled them up entirely and made the choice where to take the characters from their starting point. It was more the backstory and personality, and exactly like Linda said, the overall background, ancestry, background, and class, and like the core basics of the build. Like whether somebody was like, wouldn't be like, well, Mark said ancestry, background, and class, so this supposed knight character was a human fighter with like a background as a squire, but I decided to make them as like a horse nomad riding archer. As the build. All of the feats are about riding horses and shooting bows, even though they said it was supposed to be a knight in shining armor.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, there are some, like, you know, subclass or major build elements that might be important. And in general, when you're looking at pre-generated characters for stories, you're going to have that be the major thing that you need. And so that means that you can even have a conversation with your players. Again, getting their buy-in, getting some investment can make them feel like they own the character more. I've had players, like I said, I've run campaigns where I pre-generated the entire character. And I've had players who have told me in some cases that the pre-generated character they played, they felt like they had more ownership. Because I asked, I was a newer GM at the time. I had not designed any tabletop RPGs at that point, and I was anxious because of the taboo. So
how old were you when you first ran that campaign?
Were
you in high school?
I was
college?
I think I was in either end of high school or beginning of college the first time I ran a pre-generated campaign. And I was worried that this was like committing some kind of tabletop RPG sin. So I asked people, and some of them who had been experienced players said that they felt more ownership on that character. For they didn't know why, but that they did. Partially because of the fact that it was so interactive, the world was so attached to and that therefore the decisions they made felt like they had huge consequences and effects for like where the character went. And I actually ran the campaign twice, and in some cases, some of the characters turned out very differently from each other. So that's why Linda asked when was the first time you ran the campaign.
Yeah, because I was in the second one.
I actually ran it again in, I think I ran it once in late high school or early college. I ran the second one later on in college.
Yeah.
So, basically, if I'm going to condense down everything Linda and I just said, it's that communication, know your group, know what they want, know what they'll accept, and know what they need. And then secondly, assuming that what they are is not like the easiest possible for this, where they're just, oh, we don't care. Yeah, sure, do whatever you want. If you have any kind of reticence or any kind of players who are the kind of typical ones you hear about in the community that follow the standard where, and hey, I'm like this too. I'm not saying this is a problem. I want to have investment. I want to participate in building characters, even though I also, as the GM, have done fully pre-generated. If you have anyone like Mark or most people online, then you should involve them in some way so that they feel like they've bought in, even if in the end everything actually goes exactly as planned and basically all the things that you need have gotten in there. Because them giving approval or even you being like, pick one of these three things. It seems like it's a wide choice, but secretly you've already
found a way that each of those three could connect to what you're doing.
You've been the magician who like removed the card from the deck that was the problem card. And so I'd be like, yeah, you know what? I'm removing horse archery, but you know, you want sword and shield. You want to be a lance person on a horse. You want to be two-handed sword. Go for any of those, and maybe all of those would be okay. So you can do a lot, even if it's curating down a list of options and to take off the ones that you absolutely don't want, and then having them literally make the choice at the end of the day on a lot of features. That still, to an extent, is part of the spectrum of pre-generating characters. Because as Linda said at the beginning, it's a spectrum. It's not a dichotomy where it's like either the player does everything and then it's not a pre-generated character, or the GM does it all with no say for the players and then it is.
Yeah, but when you're pre-generating something, you want to ask sort of like, why are you pre-generating it, and make sure that you have a good payoff for what you're doing.
Exactly.
You're pre-generating certain aspects of the backstory because you have some cool choices and things for the characters to do. You're pre-generating certain aspects of the mechanics because there's like some story reason or that needs to be the case. And then when you're actually presenting the pre-generated characters, like thinking about sort of on the further end of the spectrum, you're probably going to be handing the player some kind of sheet or whatever for the character, and there's some consideration that goes into what you do for that as well. Especially if you have newer players or players who aren't going to have as much time to like sit down and grok everything, having references to the mechanics that are on the sheet can be super helpful. You might do this in the form of, cards or other smaller form factor objects or like lists or things like that. But creating those kinds of references can be very useful for sitting down and jumping in, particularly if you're in a time constrained way.
Absolutely. So Kevin Tang in chat mentions doing a session 0 where everyone builds their characters together. Absolutely a great idea. We have multiple, or at least one episode talking about that. I would consider it different than a GM pre-gen or partially pre-generated character situation, but if you're not doing that, or even if you are having the GM get to participate in it, having a session 0 where you do that is generally a good idea. So, moving to sort of the next phase about talking about, breaking this taboo like a pro. You've decided to build pre-generated characters. You've figured out what degree that you want the players to be involved and how to get their buy-in. So now let's talk about how do you make a character differently if they're a pre-generated character, or even the same, such that they will work well as a pre-generated character that somebody else is playing. And I'm talking about in terms of not just like, okay, in this campaign I needed a knight for the story beat. I'm talking about overall general techniques for this.
Yeah, so mechanically, if you know the character and you know the challenges that you're going to be throwing at your players, roughly speaking, you know what kinds of abilities and skills and things like that are going to be needed for handling those challenges. Players are going to enjoy a lot more if they're like, oh man, my character has just the tools that they need, than if you're like, oh yeah, I built a character that only does mental damage and I threw them into dungeons where everything's immune to mental, haha.
That literally happened to me.
Yes. So you want to be cognizant of making sure that the characters are built to have abilities that are going to be interesting and come up.
Yes. So this sort of Chekhov's gun technique is one way that you can get players to actually be like, wow, I liked it more when you pre-generated these characters. Because if you have an ability, especially if it's very specific, you should make sure that it's either definitely going to come up or probably going to come up. Because, I mean, just think about this, right? Players might choose an ability that's like, your character is good at negotiating with fire elementals, and if negotiation goes south, is great at like dodging the attacks of fire elementals only.
Yes.
But a player might do that. They just be like, oh, that sounded interesting, I picked it. And then if it never comes up, they might not be like, I'm mad at you for not doing fire elementals. They might be like, just so you know, I have this, and if you're a good GM and you're thinking about it, you might throw them a bone somewhere, or you might say, I don't know, man. Fire elementals is very specific.
I think that may not be the best
I
choice
know
for this
if you're going to fight any of these here in the plane of water, or here in this aquatic campaign. But if you're the GM and you built that character with the fire elemental negotiation and dodging feat, that they better be fighting a good number of fire elementals.
You don't want the players to feel like you built them a character badly or like you were trying to mess them up with what you did.
You want them to be delighted by the weird choices that you put into the character, or they don't have to be delighted if you choose like just generally good options that are just kind of gonna work overall. That's fine. They can be just like, this character works.
Yeah.
Obviously, also in the same vein, don't build like some sort of bizarre character build that that you think is going to underperform, but that you just thought was funny, unless you're building it for a player that wants to make a character that underperforms but is funny.
Yeah.
Right? Also, be cognizant of who is going to play the character, unless you are giving out a menu for people to pick, which you have to be more careful about this. If you have someone who is the player at your table, who, let's say, using Pathfinder 2 as an example, they are going to strike. Or if nothing's in range, they will move into range and then strike. And you do not want to give them a pre-generated character where the character is going to be horrible if they never use their abilities, right? Like, If it's something like a class where it's like, yes, you could spend this action to gain huge bonuses against the opponent, and you know they're not going to spend it, even though it's the core class action. They're just going to strike.
Then you don't give it to them,
Then you don't give them that character.
Or like if they're a player who's like, I really like playing spellcasters, they don't like playing martial characters, you don't give them the martial character.
That's right. Or you have someone who just takes a few hours to prepare their spells each day, and they will not use a preset list. But they're okay playing spellcasters or martials. They like all the classes. Everyone else is like, oh my gosh, when Bob plays a wizard, I do not like it. You probably shouldn't give Bob a wizard. Unless maybe Bob specifically asked to play a wizard that time, and then you have to have a conversation, but that's a different episode.
But then you could potentially, though, since it's a pre-generated character, be like, Bob's spellbook has these default lists in it.
Yep. You can be like, yeah, your character has these default lists in it. Or you could come up with some other things. Be like, well, Bob, I know you really wanted to play wizard, so you are. But as part of your backstory, your wizard unearthed a secret spellbook from an ancient magical civilization that has access to a new, unique feature of set bonuses. And so right now you've unlocked a few of these sets, and by researching and spending downtime, you might be able to unlock more of them. But basically, when you prepare exactly the sets that are in these sets that are listed, and I've put them there for you, you will gain an additional set bonus that is also listed there. And you can do whatever you want, but there's also a set bonus. And chances are, Bob is going to prepare and get the set bonus.
Yeah.
And then that could be maybe you gave a special item or ability to all of the characters as part of them being pre-generated. Since you wrote the characters, it was easy for you to put in some super special benefit at the beginning of the campaign.
Yeah.
Anytime that playing the pre-generated character makes people feel special or like they got something good or it was better for doing that, that can help them so ameliorate this sort of, but I wanted to write the character myself.
And I think another thing, too, is that you want to give enough detail to make sure the players know how the character, like, what the story is going to expect the character to do. Because you don't want the players to feel like, oh, I'm playing this character badly, or like I'm not going to get at the story or what have you, or I'm not really sure what this character is going for. So you want to make sure you give the amount of detail that the story expects the players to have for how they portray the character, but also know that you are not going to have described everything to the players that was in your head, and so there are going to be cases where that character acts differently from what you may have expected, and then, that's sort of on you as the GM to revise accordingly. Maybe this reflects that there was something a little different about the character's personality, and then you want to go back and adjust in the behind the scenes, like how people interact with them.
Right. Like, you could have in the sheet, it says, this character is the child of a ruined noble family out for revenge against the other noble family that betrayed their parents and caused them to be killed. And then maybe they see that, they know what they're supposed to do, that's good, but they play along, and then you introduce the nobles who are the treacherous nobles, and for some reason the player decides that their character has fallen in love with one of the members of that other noble family, even though you meant to portray them as kind of antagonistic and snobby. And they just do something completely different.
Yeah.
Then you could decide whether or not you're going to work with that, whether or not you want to try to have them balance the fact that they're in love with one of the children of that other family, but are trying to destroy that family at the exact same time. Or
are they just like, I'm not really interested in this whole revenge thing.
It's like, I've given up on revenge. It just will leave me as a hollow person, and I'm not even going to do that anymore. And then you can decide, like, what that means, but that's part of your GMing for later on during the campaign. The point of the pre-generated character is you did give them the high concept, and you gave them the general thrust of the arc for the character, and you let them know that in advance. You didn't just give them sort of mechanics on a sheet and the name of the character. And even if you give them a long backstory, you need to know which of your players will actually read that.
Yeah.
So you could do a 4-paragraph backstory of how much they loved their family, and then how they were betrayed and their entire home was burned down by their treacherous people. But they might not read that. Whereas if you just say you're out for revenge against these people because they destroyed your family, and it's like a 1 to 2 sentence, very condensed, high concept of the character, that can help you as well.
And you can even start with a 1 to 2 sentence condensed high concept and then have other details below. So it's like, bold high concept at the beginning and then the other stuff later.
Right. So another thing that you want to consider is that having super specific stuff in either the mechanics or the like the role playing notes for the character can make more friction between the player being able to take control of the character and make the character their own and feel invested even though you pre-generated them. So what I mean by that is something like where you tell them like, all right, Linda, I'm giving you this pre-generated character and I've got notes in there that like her laugh is funny like a donkey, and she has a strange sense of humor involving a combination of puns and dad jokes. And she always ends her sentences in a British accent.
Yeah.
Even though normally she's not talking in a British accent, she always ends them that way.
Then it's gonna be really hard to play that character.
Then even if it was not hard to play that character, it's also just like super specific and even if Linda was just like, okay, she's a method actor, she gets into it, she does all of those things.
Yeah.
It can feel like she's less invested because I gave her that many specific notes and did I really need to do that? The same is true in a mechanical sense for people who are looking for mechanics. If you give like super specific mechanics, like some kind of intricate combo that's also going to force their build of the character in later levels, and there's basically only one way to handle things. It's
like, the combo only works if they like take every turn is going to be this exact pattern or it breaks down.
Yeah, exactly.
You want the character to have options in what they do.
You want to let them make the character their own. They need to have space to do that. And whether that involves bringing them in to help build the character or not, just try not to get too overly specific. If there is something that's super specific that you need, then it's okay to put in like one thing that's like that for a reason. Like maybe of those three things that I mentioned to Linda, maybe the laughing like a donkey was important because you later find out that the character was originally a donkey who was reincarnated as a human.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, you have to. This is in here. I promise that it's relevant. It's relevant. It's relevant. But you still wouldn't have put in both of the other two things.
Or like maybe it's important for the story that like the character like it uses humor even in situations that might not always be appropriate because they got like banished from the kingdom for doing that or whatever. And then like you don't say exactly what kind of humor.
Yeah, using humor is not too overly specific.
Yeah.
Even being like, this character pulls pranks on people, that being a prankster or a trickster is an archetype. It can be part of the character's sort of like overall high concept. But then they can kind of define like, well, how do they do that? Yes. Whereas being like, they tell a mixture of puns and dad jokes is actually pretty specific about how they do that. So, as you can see, leaving it as specific enough to carry what you need. Because you have a reason why you pre-generated these characters. You didn't just do it out of the blue or on a power trip and be like, I am the game master and you are my pawns. Look at this thumbnail where Mark is looking at these people as pawns.
Yes.
Now I will control you in every way and you will have no agency.
Yeah.
You didn't do it for that reason. So you had a reason. So do exactly what you need to carry your reasons while leaving room for the players to make it their own and to do what they want.
So then, for example, if you... I do want to talk about one very broad use pregens, which you're not going to see like that often, but like for like the Pathfinder Society pregens and how they're like a little bit different. Because the Pathfinder Society pregens have to kind of assume that you don't know your table composition, you don't know what kinds of challenges that they're going to face, and so as a result, they're very broad in their scope, and their intention is to be very versatile. And you can make pregens like that too. If you want to say, okay, well, what's important about this character is this particular thing about their backstory, so I'm going to make the rest of their build very broad. And so they can approach a wide variety of situations. Because that's sort of like, with those kinds of pregens, what was known is, well, basically their backstory. They needed to fit with, like, the story from the fiction. So I think that those actually, might be more similar to some of the pregens where you're like, mechanics, whatever.
Yeah, I would say so. Or at least the ones where you leave them generic. So I just
really, because when I started that sentence, I was thinking, they're more different. But then I realized, no, they are actually kind of more similar to the ones that you know the backstory of.
Exactly. And so there are definitely some parallels in there, and it's also somewhat more similar to the situation of here are my 50 characters I built in Path Builder. Oh, you said you wanted to play a martial character? Take a look at these and customize them if you want. They are also more similar to that in a certain sense, in that they are just sort of like these generic examples of that class in a vacuum. So, and you've seen throughout this video, there's numerous different things that you might mean about playing a pre-generated character, and while there are definitely some differences, which are tied into why you pre-generated them in the first place, there's a lot of similarities. Communicate with your players, make sure that you get them to buy in using any of the techniques we mentioned throughout here, and you can have players who, honest to goodness, will tell you that they love their pre-generated characters, or that they felt somehow like it was more of their investment in it, even though you built the character or some part of it.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to cover here. Please like and subscribe, or even join if you'd like to support us. We're going to have a final vote at the end of the episode here to see what we want to do next week on Saturday. So here is the vote. You can vote for number 1, build an item workshop. Number 2, ask Arcade Mark, save my game Q&A. Number 3, player tools, keeping it simple. Number 4, Arcade Mark plays, where we play some kind of game. Or 5, other, and then you can specify.
We have our first vote for 4.
We have a vote for option 3.
Well, while folks are voting, let's give them XP.
Ah, yes. So we're going to give you some XP for watching. So make sure you've stayed at least to the moment where you got this XP. Okay, you now have the XP.
Oh man,
we've got
4, 3, and 1.
We've got a pretty significant.
The vote is divided today.
Ooh,
another
one
4,
for 4, another one for 3. Oh, this is gonna be tough.
Another 1 for 3.
Okay.
All right.
We've got a lot of people voting here. 3.
All
right,
here we go.
We're gonna be keeping it simple. So that is going to be about how to keep things simple for the parts of the game that might overwhelm you as a player or potentially be a heavy load. But there's a ways to keep it simple and to avoid that, whether that's in role playing, whether that's in builds, whether that's in mechanics in game. So
even with Kojo, Power 3's win. Matt Guy
right,
says yeah, because Kojo deferred his vote to Matt.
Yeah, so Matt Guy had a double vote from Kojo.
Yes.
So,
but it's
3 still managed to win 4-3.
I was thinking about that too. If there was otherwise like a tie or whatever, then we were gonna have to break in favor of 4.
So next time we're gonna be talking about setting the scene for and the environment for your encounter on Tuesday. So we not those tiny 10 by 10 rooms that cannot fit the monsters in them. We can have a thumb about me being like, no,
we do not do those.
Because those happen way too much in published adventures. And the next Saturday, we're going to talk about keeping it simple. Because sometimes, even I, and people know this because they've seen some of the designs I sometimes make when I get into it, can make something that's complicated because I get excited about it. But there's sometimes value in keeping things simple. Some of those Eldabon are pretty simple, Linda.
The entire Eldabon set, though.
Yeah, some of them are pretty complex. But like fires, that's like you burn things.
No, I mean like the classes and stuff. Anyway.